So for the first 30 minutes, I would say I'm going to cover these kind of 4 topics. One, I'd like to kind of give you a bit of a background of myself. And then I thought what would be quite useful is to actually maybe walk you through kind of a typical week in the life of a data scientist or ML scientist in 2 different settings. So because I've worked both in consulting and in a more kind of in a corporate setting as well, I just wanted to kind of give you what are the similarities and show you some of the similarities, the differences between different settings where you might find yourselves working in. Then I thought it might be useful for us to kind of go through some kind of tips for landing your first data/ML job, and also maybe we'll have a look at some tips for doing well after you get your first ML job. Again, feel free to maybe kind of write your questions down in the chat window, and we can probably have a discussion towards the end. And of course, first let's start with my background, right? So I did a degree in electrical engineering and a research degree in signal processing, also in the electrical engineering department. So my research was around using statistical learning algorithms to estimate the frequency of the electricity grid. So basically, some of you might know that the electricity grid has like a frequency around 50 hertz, but it's not exactly 50 hertz all the time. It can be kind of higher or lower depending on the supply and demand imbalance in the system, basically. So again, this was quite a well-known problem in electrical engineering and signal processing, because it's used everywhere, not only in the electricity grid, it's used in kind of noise cancellation, in speech processing, etc. So just because all of these kind of audio-related applications have some kind of frequency estimation embedded in it. But why was I kind of doing research in an area that was already kind of quite mature? And that's because with the kind of introduction of new renewable sources in the electricity grid, the frequency actually changes more rapidly, because if you kind of, I don't want to go into too much detail, but with kind of new renewable sources like wind and solar, basically you inject new source of energy at kind of random times of the day, and that makes the frequency of the electricity grid a bit unstable. So what you'd need is basically kind of newer algorithms to see or to track this frequency more rapidly. So my research was around kind of like, how do we use some of the more latest techniques to kind of speed up the estimation of the this latent variable, which was the frequency of the electricity grid. So then I basically moved on from academia to industry in 2017 because I was very interested in kind of business in general, and I wanted to kind of get a broader exposure to data science outside of academia. And the field was just kind of growing at that point. And I was lucky enough to get my first job at a consulting firm called BCG Gamma. So this is BCG is a management consulting firm, and Gamma is like the advanced analytics unit of this firm. And I joined BCG in 2017, and I was there till last year actually, so for about 3.5 years. And at BCG I worked on kind of various different types of data science projects in different industries. Mainly a lot of my projects were in retail. So I was working in kind of retail pricing and promotions. So if you think of your kind of supermarket and supermarket promotions, for example, you get a 2-for-1 or 50% off. I was working on some kind of ML or data science algorithms to better price some of these promotions so that you can actually maximize revenue or profit. We can go through some of, if you have questions around on the types of work I was doing at Gamma, maybe we can kind of discuss that towards the end. And so yeah, I was focusing on a wide range of projects, and I wanted to basically go deeper into a specific industry And I kind of always had an interest in investments, etc. And this opportunity opened up at AIG, which is the insurance firm. And AIG has basically what it, so any insurance firm, once it collects its premiums, it needs to basically invest the premiums into like different kinds of assets. And so the investments department at AIG has about, I would say, I think the last time I checked, it's about $300 billion of assets under management across different types of asset classes. And so the department where I work in is called Investments AI. And that's basically, it's like a, if you can think of it as like an innovations department where we work on different types of AI or ML products to assist portfolio managers to make better decisions in making investments. And so the funny thing is, like, you might think some, like I was working in retail at Gamma, and then I'm working in kind of investments now. But the funny thing is, it's like a lot of the techniques and the thinking behind and the work as a data scientist is quite similar. Of course, there's some domain specific things that you have to learn, but a lot of the core techniques, both from the kind of the science part and also the engineering part, it's quite transferable. So that's, I think that's part of the reason why data science, ML, data engineering, etc., is quite attractive, because it actually cuts through many domains actually. And outside of work, during lockdown, when I had a lot of free time, I actually started two different initiatives. One is a meetup called, actually both of them are kind of meetups, and one is called Naive Bayesians. I hope you get the pun in the name. And it's about basically making Bayesian methods more accessible to people. So basically, it was just a virtual meetup where people just presented different Bayesian techniques in different applications. And the other kind of initiative that I ran predominantly during lockdown, it's a bit slow, both of these initiatives now, it's actually around product data science. So this is basically, it's not super widespread in the UK, but if you look at a lot of, or if you look at the data science market in the US, there's a kind of vertical around data science or analytics for product, which is kind of, it covers many things like A/B testing, setting metrics for basically product-led companies. So if you think of kind of Facebook, TikTok, Dropbox, etc., when companies have like products as their kind of core revenue engine, product analytics and product data science becomes quite an important vertical of data science. Besides the whole kind of ML component for those products, the analyzing and looking at the growth of the products can be is quite important. And so I started like kind of a meetup around this also at some point in 2021. So again, basically a bunch of different things. But today I'd like to start off with maybe some of you know this, but just like to cover kind of firstly kind of typical ML projects that I've dealt with. And this is kind of, it covers, I would say, quite a huge spectrum of the types of projects you might encounter when you get your ML, data science, data engineering job. I mean, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably because I think it's the type of work you do is quite similar. And at one end of the spectrum, you have basically scoping. This is typically done by slightly or more senior members of the team, where basically you think about, okay, you basically plan a machine learning or data science project depending on the business question that is asked. So this would involve, okay, basically coming up with a rough idea of the techniques that you might use to solve this problem, kind of, well, defining the problem concretely, turning it into a data science problem specifically, planning out some of the techniques you would use, some of the data that you would need, and the output, and or planning out how the output would be consumed, or how it'll be integrated with your system. So below each of these kind of typical ML projects, I also gave a quick estimate on how long each type of project would take. Again, these are very rough estimates. Depending on your project and your company, this could be quite different. So scoping typically shouldn't go more than 2 weeks. Proof of concepts or POCs basically involve someone just getting the data and doing some EDA and building a basic model to see if something would work. So this, at the proof of concept stage, you don't have basically users interacting with your model. It's mainly the engineering team that kind of interacts with the building of the model and the building of the full pipeline. And only, let's say, the output is consumed by your stakeholders. And this should take anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks. And the next stage is actually building like a minimum viable product. And this is where you basically jump from only the engineering team who's handling the model to where you actually expose your product, which is your kind of your data product, to end users. And these end users could be power users, or they could be actually less of a power user. So it could be like just general business users, etc. And this is why it'll take up to like 10 weeks to 12 weeks, which is about 3 months, to build something, because here you want to have this thing, either it could be a dashboard, it could be a web app, it could be something, and this should be and someone who's not part of the engineering team should be able to kind of access this and use this analytics tool without kind of a lot of intervention from the tech team. So that's why it takes a bit longer to build. And this is where like engineering becomes more of a focus. Maybe what I should have done is also kind of maybe added another role, which with the different kind of emphasis on the different parts of the kind of the data pipelines. And so where engineering becomes a bit more of a focus from MVP onwards. And then on the kind of, I've kind of gathered everything else into full ML product. I do recognize that in, let's say, if you're working for a product-based company like Facebook or something, the ML product is integrated, or the kind of the data science or ML product is not only kind of consumed by decision makers as a data or analytics tool, but it's actually integrated with the core product itself. So that could mean that you have a recommendation system that is part of your app or website, or it could mean you have a spam detector that is integrated with your kind of messaging app, whatever, right? So this full ML products kind of as a catch-all for anything where you have a lot of users using it, and this should have basically very little intervention from the tech team. So that's why it takes longer to build, because there are more edge cases. You want things to kind of not break in production, right? Again, engineering becomes a huge focus here again. Part of the reason why I made this slide is to, I think, emphasize something that you already know, I guess, which is there's a huge focus on good engineering in any data project, whether it's some kind of data, some kind of analytics dashboard, or if it's a core kind of ML component in your product. Engineering becomes the forefront of everything after a certain point. And yeah, depending, it also depends on the company, of course, but I think that's why I found the kind of program structure of AI Core to be quite interesting, because I think from what I've read and from what I've spoken to Harry, etc., I saw a huge kind of focus on engineering, and I think that's the right way to do it, because if you kind of look at this, the different types of ML projects, you see the longest ML projects are the ones that actually require the most engineering, and that means that the kind of the demand for engineering talent is actually much higher compared to just modeling talent or statistical talent. I think most of you probably know this already, so just kind of to emphasize this again. So now we're going to actually look at a typical week for an ML scientist, and this is, I would say, I just made this typical week based on my current job. So I think what you can see here is I've tried to basically color code different kind of parts of the job, and so that, say, there's like problem formulation is more about how do you take a business problem and convert it into a data science problem. Planning is more about basically how do you, it's about kind of scoping and planning for resources, etc. Again, you might get this, you might do more planning when you're kind of more senior or when you become a manager, etc. But it's kind of good to know that planning is a core component of any tech job, to be honest, because you're not only planning about, planning means that you're planning a sprint or a bunch of sprints, and that includes like dependencies, resourcing, etc., etc., etc. Then you have communication as well, and I think I broke it down to kind of written comms and stakeholder management. And stakeholder management basically just means that kind of you are speaking to stakeholders kind of verbally or in the meetings. And written comms means that sometimes you need actually to write reports, write memos, emails, slides, etc. And of course, you have modeling and software engineering. Currently, my current like this typical week was basically based on my a typical week for me, but 6 months ago, where I was doing more modeling compared to engineering. So you'd see that there's a lot more kind of green blocks compared to blue blocks. I would say like, so green in the sense that modeling blocks compared to software engineering blocks. And I'm not going to go through kind of each day, but what you can see is that, okay, there's some code review, there's some model review. So this is where it's not only like, you're not only doing code review, but you might be kind of discussing your model itself and the outputs and some of the diagnostics of your model with another data scientist or machine learning scientist. And there's, in the modeling part, there's also, I also do some research, so like reading articles, etc. And of course, there is software engineering, where you're either building a pipeline, and then also there's some professional development, like learning from a domain expert, etc. So I'm going to kind of quickly, because I want to kind of allocate enough time for Q&A, I'm going to quickly go to the week in the life of a data scientist in consulting, where the mix of types of work actually changes a bit. So the first thing to realize is that it's very similar, and that's the point that I mentioned before, is regardless of the domain you go into, the job actually is quite similar, and that can be quite rewarding actually, because you can go into different industries, domains, etc., and start contributing and adding value from day one. Some of the differences that I'd like to highlight here is that when I was in consulting before COVID, there was travel. So I was typically kind of working from a client site 3 to 4 days a week and working in the home office on Fridays. So that's the first thing I would like to highlight. The second thing is that there was the days were actually longer. So I explicitly didn't actually put some timelines here, but you can kind of guess that there was actually lots of things going on, because at the end of a consulting project, you typically hand it over to a client team, and so that involves a lot of kind of communication, planning, etc. That you need to kind of work with the IT teams, the client data science teams, etc. And there's a lot of stakeholder management becomes a bigger part of your job. And again, actually, funnily enough, engineering also becomes a bigger part of your job, because unlike my current role, where I can do a lot more research, when you're in consulting, typically you are trying to kind of build something that is less experimental, that you still, of course, you can experiment and do things that are new, but because projects are shorter and you need to actually kind of deliver quickly, there's a lot of emphasis on building things that work and building them fast. And I'll come to kind of some of the habits, good habits that I learned from consulting that that might actually help you in your first data science job in the next slide, actually. Again, we can go over some of these individual blocks in the Q&A. So before actually getting through, I mean, going through some of the tips of doing well in your first data science job, I think the most important thing for most of you is to actually get your first data science job, or data engineering or machine learning science job. So again, and I would say, like, I'm pretty sure there's a career track, etc., that actually covers a lot of this. But if I would give you like one big tip, is that recruiters are your best friends. So basically, just from my experience, right, I've had very little success applying for jobs using kind of online forms, including LinkedIn, some of the LinkedIn jobs, etc. I think I've had a few kind of follow-up or interview calls, etc. But just from my personal experience and speaking to some of my friends, colleagues, most opportunities actually come through recruiters. Well, it is true in the UK at the moment, actually. So I would say, if you're kind of planning to really kind of double down on getting your first job, I would say focus on trying to speak to recruiters. And the first step in this is to actually have an up-to-date LinkedIn profile. And this is a quote from an ML recruiter in the Bay Area, actually, who I spoke to, and which made this like super clear for me. And she was saying that her days were actually filled with back-to-back calls, so she needs to kind of reach out to potential candidates, etc. And from her perspective, if you think about it, right, let's say you have two candidates, and one candidate, and let's assume that everything is equal, right? They have the same amount of experience, they have the same skill set, etc. And one candidate has an up-to-date LinkedIn profile with some bullet points and some information on what they did, and the other has a very sparse LinkedIn profile, just maybe with where they worked at, etc., and the job titles. And for a recruiter to reach out to you, they want to be sure that they don't want to waste their time, right? Because their time is valuable, and the person without a lot of information, there's just a lot more ambiguity in what they can do and what their experiences are. So they'll be less likely to reach out to you compared to someone who has a slightly more filled LinkedIn profile, right? So the first tip here is to actually have an up-to-date LinkedIn profile. So after, just to give you like an analogy here, is that I had a very I didn't kind of concentrate on my LinkedIn profile at all. But once I heard this analogy by an actual recruiter, it made a lot of sense. So then I actually started to populate it with like kind of bullet points, etc., that would be helpful for recruiters. And again, your LinkedIn profile is basically designed for recruiters. It's not designed for anyone else. So the way I treat LinkedIn is my portal to communicate with recruiters. Yes, I have other contacts, etc., but that's like secondary. My main focus is LinkedIn as a recruitment portal, right? And again, I recommend you reaching out to recruiters, and as a kind of a rough goal, aim to speak to a recruiter a week on the phone. I mean, again, what you typically experience is that when you start reaching out for the first 2 or 3 weeks, you wouldn't have you might not get replies, etc. But then the momentum will build up, and by the 3rd or 4th week, you'll start actually getting calls, etc. So don't let your first 3 or 4 weeks kind of deter you from reaching out to recruiters, because in everything that you do, there's like you basically kind of need to build the momentum of the flywheel so that it actually starts working out. It takes about 4 weeks for anything, any kind of lead gen. So finally, these are kind of the 3 points that I would say can really distinguish you as a data scientist or data engineer, etc. And the first thing is, I would say, the most important thing, which is it's called drive to early output, which is, let's say you have a task that you want to do, or you've been given a task, etc. Right? Always start thinking about, how do I get this done quicker than planned? How can I get an early indication of the result of this task ASAP? And that could mean, so the first thing to do is to basically begin at the end. So think about, okay, what is the decision that's going to be made from this output, or what is the output that I need to get to, and then work backwards instead of working from the data forwards. If some of this sounds a bit too abstract, because we can actually have a discussion in about 5 minutes, basically. And the second tip for to get to early output is think about if you can get in kind of an intermediate answer, or an indication of an answer of the analysis that you're looking for, without building a full model. So think about, okay, how can I build a simpler model to get just like a rough idea of what the results are going to be like, or what the problems are going to be like. The third tip is to actually, can you output in stages? So for example, let's say you're writing a report or a memo or a slide deck, etc. Instead of, let's say, sending it to your manager after everything is complete, maybe think about, can you send it in stages, so you can actually get feedback sooner than rather than later, right? So can you output in stages? And the fourth tip here is that I see this a lot in data science, actually. So let's say you get stalled in a step. So there's a blocker. For example, you don't know what a column name means. You don't know if you can get a certain data set. Instead of kind of just stopping, can you assume an answer? Can you say that, okay, just using your best guess, okay, the column name means this, or let's create like a dummy data set for this, and then proceed. So you always try to think about, like, how can I get to the end? So you first start with begin at the end, and then you go back and you don't ever stop until you get at the end ASAP. So that's what gets you early output. Feel free to ask me questions towards the end. Yeah. The second tip is actually to think about what is the so what of your model, or etc., or your whatever you're working on. Because at the end of the day, whatever you're working on in a business setting tries to get to increase in profits or revenue or some kind of business goal. Think about how the question that you're trying to answer will change the decision, etc. So again, it's pretty abstract. Maybe I should give you a better example later. And the last tip is actually to, this is the hardest one, actually. I find this for me, it's like go to the gym kind of thing, right? It's the right thing to do, but it's hard to do because it actually requires a lot of discipline and energy. And that's to be hypothesis driven, which is, for example, when you have to do some EDA, or you want to actually build a model for something, or you're trying to build something, right? Or you're trying to do some research on something. What most people do, including me, is that we start with the data, or we start with the information, or we start with the paper, and we start to consume information instead of first thinking about logically what is needed to solve the question I have in my head, and then only focusing on the parts that are relevant to that question. So for example, if you have a question, how do I do X, right? Instead of, let me go and read everything around X, and then this will help me figure out how to do X. Even before touching a piece of data or writing a piece of code, or a line of code, sorry, just take a piece of paper and just guess. Basically, what hypothesis basically just means guessing. Just guess, okay, this can be solved using Y, and that will be true if A, B, and C are true. So you just kind of think about it yourself. And then when you look at the data, or when you look at the reading that you need to do, you'll be primed for looking at you'll be primed so that your focus actually going towards answering the specific sub questions within your question, instead of just trying to just gather information. And this basically speeds up your output by a lot. But it's hard to do because you have to actually kind of sit down and think, and that's sometimes it's easier to just go and write some code or look at the data or start reading stuff. And it's harder to actually think because it just kind of requires mental energy, and we as humans kind of try to conserve energy as much as possible. And so, yeah, so that's kind of big 3 tips around doing well in your first data job. This will make you stand out to your managers, actually. So again, a mix of things. I hope this was useful.